So let's get going. I think about this a lot when it comes to nutrition, misinformation, and I wonder why we get to a point. Why is it that we have these oils specifically singled out? And if you're just Googling around the internet, I mean, some of the stuff that comes up is both hilarious and frightening with the views that people have about these oils. And I've always wanted to try and think about a taxonomy of seed oil misinformation. And this is likely not exhaustive, but this is something that I notice in the characteristics of some of the debates I've had with certain individuals that are very anti-seed oils and just generally in the conversation. So I think if we look up here, we've got this big naturalistic fallacy, and I've separated this from conspiratorial thinking because they are different. There's a lot of people that can fall prey to naturalistic fallacy without necessarily being a conspiracy thinker. And it's very common in nutrition. Okay, this idea that if something's natural, whatever that means, it is by default better. And so a big part of this is obviously the fact that these oils are processed. Although we have a long-standing human history of trying to extract oils from nuts or seeds or fruits, it's a difficult, laborious process. So in order to produce for the scale of our current food markets, then there needs to be some degree of processing involved. And of course, that's a big knock against these oils for people that see them as unnatural, quote unquote. Again, whatever unnatural actually means. And this obviously coincides very nicely with this idea that, well, we're divorced from nature, we're divorced from our evolutionary ancestral diet, and we should really eat according as best we can to those dietary principles, at least, or characteristics. And very specifically, there's a big emphasis in that on dietary fat. And a big part of that comes with this idea that, the information that we have about cardiovascular disease from the 50s and 60s was all a big lie, that it's the seed oils that are to blame, not saturated fat, etc. So we've got this, but these ideas, these naturalistic fallacies do link in with conspiratorial thinking. There's a number of predictors with conspiratorial thinking that are quite interesting, but one is this concept of low cognitive complexity. Now, that doesn't mean someone's thick at all. It's not necessarily related to IQ. It means that they have a certain thinking style that is more intuitive, like they'll just go with their gut feeling about something rather than something being analytic. And when faced with two different explanations for something, they'll always typically opt for the most simple one possible rather than the complex one. So it's a lack of cognitive capacity to entertain with or deal with very complex phenomenon, and a tendency then to go with the gut. And that obviously then this intuitive rather than analytic thinking style will relate to some of these naturalistic fallacies. And then we've got collective narcissism, and this is a huge thing in conspiratorial thinking. This is this idea that the in-group bias of whatever the conspiratorial thinking buys into creates this very us versus them, whoever they are, type of narrative around what they believe in. And that's often fairly typical. It's quite predictably anti-government, anti-authority. The scientists were paid by Big Sugar and they lied to us, and then the government, wanted to make you sick and blah, blah, blah. So this feeds into the collective in-group narcissism that characterizes these types of groups. And so ultimately it leads us to, this is a great map from the Foresight group, which mapped various domains and and all these little dots, individual factors related to obesity. And so you can obviously see this is a veritable spider's web. It's as complex as it gets. So this allows them all ultimately to reject this in favor of the most simplistic explanation available to them that accords with both their naturalistic fallacy thinking and this kind of conspiratorial view of diet and health, to blame seed oils in their entirety. So when you see the claims made against seed oils, it's not that, oh, well, they might increase risk for cardiovascular disease. It's blamed for every single adverse health outcome in the population today. Obesity itself, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancer, anything else, rheumatoid arthritis, everything and anything that you can think of as a health outcome is laid squarely at the doorstep of seed oils and linoleic acid, the omega-6 essential fatty acid specifically. So this is why I think this is particularly, and again, I don't offer this as some sort of exhaustive or even necessarily correct taxonomy. It's more reflecting my kind of personal view of why there's such vilification of these otherwise fairly benign and potentially healthy oils. So this obviously means we should go back to the beginning, our ancestors. Possibly the biggest overlap between any kind of dietary pattern or style within the anti-seed oil community is the ancestral health movement, which in itself really is more of an iteration of low carbohydrate dieting. And there are certain tenets of how they view the evolutionary diet. One is that, well, we would have eaten a lot of animal meats, therefore the diet must have been high in saturated fat, therefore saturated fat can't really be associated with heart disease. So we'll think about that. And then the other is, well, these industrial seed oils that require the food industry to manufacture them, they wouldn't have existed, so they shouldn't be part of our diet. But linoleic acid existed. So let's actually look at some of the evidence that we have. This is a paper from one of the really seminal Paleolithic researchers, S. Boyd Eaton, in a paper that he published in 1992, Humans, Lipids, and Evolution. This paper was very much focused on fat and fat composition. But one of the things about the diet back then, and this is based off both the geographic area that we know that our genus, our species evolved in, which essentially corresponds to kind of East Africa today, the climate that would have been anticipated to have been prevalent at that point in time, and looking at the composition of animals that are there today to make correlations. And really, although that their diet would have contained a lot of meat, what we typically see is that with the gain composition, fatty acid composition, these animals were very lean. They didn't have a need for seasonal variation in fat. They didn't need to get fat for the winter because it was cold. And they also needed to be lighter because a lot of these animals were prey. So they're on open savannas being hunted down by a lion. They need to be quick. They need to not be burdened by high body weight, and they don't need seasonal variation in fat. All in all, the fat composition was much leaner, but of the fatty acid composition, the wild game fatty acid content was about 3 times higher in polyunsaturated fats than commercial meat now. And this was both omega-3 and also related to omega-6 fatty acids as well. So it was not meat that was high in saturated fat. And this is important when we think about what the actual overall fatty acid breakdown would have looked like. Boyd Eaton's estimations were that saturated fat would have only approximated about 6% of total daily energy intake. So that's far lower than what modern iterations of the ancestral diet are recommending or proposing to uphold. And then if we break down the source of saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated fat by source, we can see that obviously polyunsaturated fats along with mono formed the predominant, as a proportion of total fat intake, predominant fatty acids. So this was a diet very high in unsaturated fats in total. And importantly, we'll come back to this ratio when we look at some of the controlled feeding studies, the polyunsaturated to saturated fatty acid ratio, 1.45. So reflecting a very high intake of polyunsaturated fats relative to saturated fats. But we can see that actually it was plant sources of polyunsaturated fats that were the predominant source of PUFA in the evolutionary diet. And this is probably more reflective of gathering rather than hunting. So these were sources coming from nuts or seeds themselves, edible seeds and nuts that would have been foraged and gathered. And this is, of course, relevant to then when we move on to consider the production of oils today. While, of course, they lacked the technology to produce oils in this way, the actual source of these oils and the fatty acids being provided relatively the same. So we know that this wasn't a diet that was particularly high in saturated fat, although there are other estimates that I'm going to come on to now and discuss that put the range of saturated fat slightly broader. But overall, we know that this was a diet that was higher in polyunsaturated fat, including omega-6, compared to saturated fat. So how is this relevant for cardiovascular disease now? Well, again, a big part of this evidence is this relationship between polyunsaturated and saturated fat, because the controlled feeding studies that we're going to come on to look at in a while clearly have always shown that that is the most important predictor of blood cholesterol levels. If you have a polyunsaturated to saturated fat ratio akin to what we had in evolution with much higher polyunsaturated fat intake, this is the most important dietary variable that will lower blood cholesterol levels, total and LDL cholesterol levels. So this idea that the ancestral diet was high in saturated fat and that we don't need to worry about cholesterol as a result simply isn't supported by any available evidence. This is comparing hunter-gatherer humans with modern Americans, and we've got them compared to non-human primates, baboons, howler monkeys. We've got them compared to other mammals as well. And if we look at unacculturated human populations, we can see that the Inuit are the ones with the highest cholesterol levels. And of course, they've been the subject of a lot of great myths. Oh, they eat really high fat. It's all whale blubber. They're robustly healthy. They're not. The observation of supposed cardiovascular health in this population really just came from a survey in the 1970s. It wasn't very robust research. More recent research in 2014 by a group in Canada in conjunction with a group in Norway basically did a more comprehensive age-matched analysis, matching Inuit populations in Canada and Greenland with Danish controls. So essentially they had CAD, coronary artery disease, and stroke rates that were in excess of the expected mortality in the Danish population. So we've got low saturated fat intake overall. We've got fairly low cholesterol levels overall in terms of unacculturated, or what they call hunter-gatherer human populations. How might this also then relate to the overall diet composition? So the paper we just looked at, Boyd Eaton's research, was an earlier paper, 1992. And obviously trying to research in this distant past is a really different kettle of fish. You've got to use all these different analytical techniques to look at bone and otherwise to try and piece together what diet might have looked like. So this group, which included the previous author, Boyd Eaton, and Lauren Cordain, and a couple of heavy hitters in the Paleolithic nutrition research space, in 2010 published this updated paper. And I think this is the best attempt to represent potential diversity in the evolutionary diet. They came up with different models based on a ratio of animal food to plant food intake. So they had, on the one extreme, 70% of energy from animal source foods and 30 from plants. And then on the other, 30 from animals, 70 from plants. And they modeled everywhere in between that, making certain assumptions about the types of foods that would have been in that diet. And they ended up with 4 models. One was what they called a selective meat-based diet. What selective meant was that they didn't eat adipose tissue, like they didn't eat the fat off the animal, and they didn't eat organ meats. They ate muscle meat, they ate brain, and they ate bone marrow. And then they only ate meat in this dietary pattern. There was no fish intake. And then we had a non-selective meat and fish-based diet. Now, non-selective in this really means they ate everything, every part of a carcass they ate. So they ate the adipose tissue here, they ate organ meats, liver as well. They ate fish, but they would eat the fish heads. It's an assumption that they would have eaten every part of a killed animal. And then we have a selective diet that was meat and fish based. So in this, they're not eating the fish head or brain. They're eating the muscle flesh off the fish. And again, they're eating lean muscle meats. They're eating brain. They're eating bone marrow. And then there was a non-selective fish-based diet. So in this, 100% of energy intake from animal-sourced foods was coming from fish. And because we know that linoleic acid, or omega-6, is essential, we know that probably about a minimum of 1% of energy intake is required. So each of these diets had to fit certain constraints. They had a constraint on total protein intake, because there's only so far you can go in protein intake before you're not actually covering bases for fats and carbohydrates. And they had a minimum 1% for omega-6. So each of these diets had to have a minimum of 1% omega-6. So as far as our main interest today, omega-6 and linoleic acid goes, in terms of grams per day, this is LA here, linoleic acid. This selective meat-based diet had really about 10 grams a day in this estimate, in this model estimate, in a range of maybe 8.5 to just over 11. The non-selective diet, which included fish, about 11.3 grams as an estimate, and a range from nearly, say, 5.5 to 19, nearly 20 grams a day. The fish and meat-based but selective diet, again, similar estimates to the meat-based, about nearly 10 grams a day in a range 7 to 12. And the fish-based one slightly lower, 7 grams as an average estimate and 5 to 9. And then if we think about this as a percentage of energy, this is going to be quite important as we go through this, right? So think about these claims, oh, our evolutionary ancestral diet didn't have these fats that are now everywhere in our diet in terms of current intakes. Well, so in this diet, the meat selective diet, an average of 3% linoleic acid and a range of nearly just 2.7 to 3.5. And then the non-selective. So the reason this is interesting is because this is the diet where most aspects of meat would have been eaten. And the estimate here, 3.6% on average, but a range of 1.7 to 6.2%. And then the fish and meat-based but selective, again, the range is less because the scope of fatty acid or fatty tissue meat being consumed is less. And then the purely fish-based one, less again. Now, the reason I think this is important is because there's a number of fallacies, essentially, that people who recommend looking at an ancestral diet to vilify omega-6 fatty acids end up stepping into their own fallacy, because they're concomitantly recommending fatty meat. They're recommending people eat liver and organ meats for health. And yet this is the diet that we know would have had up to the maximum ceiling of linoleic acid in the diet, and an average of nearly 4%. So where does this stack up against current intakes? Well, in the US, we've got an average of about 16 grams and 12.6 grams for men and women, respectively, which is 6% and 5.5% of energy. So we could say perhaps at the most that current US intakes are at the upper threshold of the evolutionary ranges based on these estimates from these models. And in terms of grams per day, these really are in this range of what would be consumed in this non-selective meat and fish-based diet. So we're not necessarily that divorced from this ancestral diet. In the UK, it's lower overall, 10 grams, nearly 10 grams each, men and women, and that's 5% of total daily energy intake in both. So they're really more akin to kind of, they're towards that upper range. And again, I'm going to come back to this later when we look at tissue biomarker studies. But really, there's a disconnect between the claims that this that linoleic acid was absent this diet or needs to be minimized in a modern context, because our actual population averages aren't really that high, and they're certainly not outside the range of the various models that were produced in this really comprehensive analysis. So at the end of our little walk down evolutionary memory lane, we've two questions. One is, if current levels are within ancestral ranges, what happens if linoleic acid in the diet or measured in the body exceeds this range? Are we now presuming, because it's ancestrally inconsistent, that we see adverse health outcomes? And then two, if we assume that someone says, well, I can accept that the current intakes are roughly the same, but what really matters is the food sources. Back then they were eating, they were getting some of their linoleic acid omega-6 from meats, and they were getting others from natural nuts or seeds rather than processed. So is it a question of food source? And if that's the case, can we look at evidence for these foods, these new foods, to try and come up with some answers? So keep these questions in your head as we go through. So in the making. This is obviously a big part of the negative press that seed oils claim. And it's obviously not necessarily, I think, controversial in any way, shape, or form that we need to process these into edible oils as much as we need to process olive oil, as much as we need to process very much of our food supply. There are older methods, screw press. There's mechanical, if we're extracting oil in terms of methods, mechanical methods. This is what would have been used through human history. There is evidence of a history of people extracting oils from seeds and from nuts, but it would have involved wrapping them in cloth and leaving them and pressing them, and very labor intensive over time. And then there was the screw press, which is basically just like a giant kind of grinder. And then a hydraulic press developed. But what we use is solvent extraction. So that was mechanical methods of extraction, very labor intensive, not conducive to a food supply like ours. And then there's chemical extraction, of which the main way of extracting oil from seeds or fruits or nuts is through solvent extraction. And this is the main source of the panic, right? This is where you'll say, oh, they mix it with this solvent. And it's really just, it's a fundamental misunderstanding of basic chemistry. But I thought it's really helpful to have a basic understanding. And this is really going down a food science lane that's even outside of my general kind of domain of knowledge. So I've been bouncing this off friends that are in the more the food science space than the kind of health nutrition science space like me. So I've deliberately tried to simplify this as much as possible for all of our benefit. But again, there's a couple of key questions that we can ask to try and get to the bottom of whether this is something we should be worried about. So what does solvent chemical extraction mean? Well, a solvent typically is just talking about this kind of chemical interaction. There's two methods still used in terms of extracting from seed oils. One does still involve heating and pressing, and that will produce an oil, but it will also produce this kind of cake. They call it a press cake, which is basically almost like a meal of the seeds or nuts, if it's a nut oil, kind of ground and pressed together. And then that uses, that's interacted then with hexane. So hexane, yes, it is a byproduct of petroleum, okay? But that doesn't say anything necessarily about its health effects or why it's being used at this stage in the process. So the press cake is mixed with the solvent to extract the oil. Okay, so a solvent is something that is going to like draw out, in this case, what we're looking to draw out is the oil from the actual press cake. And hexane is incredibly efficient at this because it means there's very little oil actually left in the press cake afterwards. And the press cake is just itself discarded. But the idea that hexane is just like then in our oil and people, you'll see these crazy claims like, oh, we're drinking petrol. Well, it's not, because as soon as this step has been undertaken, the mixture itself is heated to a certain point that any remaining solvent evaporates. Okay, and we can look then at the actual oil that we ultimately get on our shelf to see whether there's solvent remaining in it. So that's the process of solvent extraction, and ultimately the combination of the oil produced from extraction from the press case and from pressing. Then we're left with this crude oil. And that has to go through these various stages. And these are also, I think, very misunderstood. So we talk about, well, refined oils as if the word refining is necessarily bad. Well, really what this is a collection of stepwise processes that remove impurities from the oil so that ultimately what we end up with is an oil that's characterized by its nutrition content, the specific nutrition content with impurities removed. The refining process is usually just citric acid, lemon juice, essentially. And this is enriched into the oil, and this will have certain actions like killing off certain oxidative byproducts, because citric acid is itself acts as a free radical scavenger. And it removes impurities like circulating free fatty acids, because ultimately we want a triglyceride-based food product. and it removes these impurities from the oil. And there's this process of bleaching. And I've honestly seen people interpret this to mean that bleach like is added to the oil. And that's not really what's going on. The reason it became known as bleaching is because oils like this will have levels of chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is very green. So in this bleaching phase, there's an adsorbent is added to the oil to draw up and out of the oil any further impurities. This is also these kind of stages like aldehyde or ketone bodies that might be in the oil, like fatty acid byproducts. But the main thing is the reduction in the chlorophyll content, which leaves us with a kind of clearer, more yellowy oil. So this term bleaching isn't because they're adding bleach to it. It's because it's actually taking that kind of green that you would get if you had a chlorophyll-rich product, and it's actually reducing that level to the point where you have a clearer product. And it will also get rid of trace metals as well. And then the final step then is deodorizing. So this is known as like RBD, like refining, bleaching, deodorizing. The refining and bleaching process, that oil now has impurities largely removed. This step is about removing any remaining compounds that may influence the odor of it. Again, any residual aldehydes or ketones that are in. And it also has the effect, because carotenoids are red to orange to red spectrum, and it also has the effect, because it's steam distilled, of decolorizing those carotenoids. So again, at the end, we're left with a nice clear oil that you can largely see through, and it doesn't have chlorophyll in it, kind of tinting it green. It doesn't have carotenoids in it, tinting it red. So yes, this is food science. This is chemical extraction. It's a solvent-based extraction. But all of these methods have been developed and are regulated, and ultimately they're quite divorced from the types of claims that you see, like bleach is being added to these oils. It's not. This is food science, and a lot of the more technical details of what happens at a refining, bleaching, and deodorizing stage is really just chemistry. But it's very easy to take these kind of chemistry sounding terms and make them into a kind of a Frankenstein type of perception of these food products. So do we have any evidence for potential effects of this process in terms of, do we end up with gasoline in our oils? Well, we do. This was a study that reviewed up to 46 different oils, 23 different brands, basically was looking at hexane levels in these brands of vegetable oil. And basically what it found was, and this included sunflower, corn oil, canola oil. So most compounds in a food supply will have a maximum residue level, or MRL, and we will have that for any sorts of compounds that are used in this manner in food production. And in EU, the MRL is about 1 milligram of hexane per kilogram of body weight. And basically what this analysis found was that hexane residue was either under the lower limit of detection, like it was essentially undetectable in the oil, or if it was present, it was in concentrations no greater than about 42 micrograms per kilogram. So far below the actual maximum residue level that would be permitted under EU law. So there's really no reason to be concerned about the process of producing edible oils resulting in some form of level of, in this case, hexane as the main solvent that's used in chemical solvent extraction, adversely influencing human health to any magnitude of detectable degree. Ultimately, and this is really important, because when people make this argument that this method of producing oils is somehow alien or produces something that is of real concern, what we end up with is a product that's defined by its nutritional composition, not the processing method. And this is really important. So whenever this issue is raised, I'm like, tell me what is wrong. Just putting our nutrition hats on, looking through the fat, the monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fat content, and the saturated fat ratio. This is canola oil now, or rapeseed oil. Carbohydrate, and we know that there's other compounds in it, like vitamin E, some polyphenols, vitamin K. So what I ask people to do is objectively tell me, looking at these nutrients with everything we know about nutrition, what's wrong with this oil. And that's where they start to struggle, of course, because in the absence of being able to say, well, it's bleached, or it goes through this completely, warped, messed up processing method, I'm like, well, explain to me what's messed up about it. And again, without the technical expertise to be able to go into any detail, they're really relying on these heuristics. Okay, these really simplified, well, it's bleached. Well, they use hexane to extract the oil, of course. And this is why I think it's important for you to be able to be at least armed with that evidence to say, well, we don't really end up with any detectable hexane that's of any concern for human health in the final product. So tell me what's wrong with this on a nutrition level. And this is really important. These are oils characterized by their nutrient composition, not the processing method. Okay. Let's delve back into more actual nutrition science and away from the kind of food science stuff. This is Ansel Keys. This is one of the biggest focus of ire in the ancestral health community. And this is where so much of the sacred cows of the anti-seed oil crowd really start to just crumble and fall apart, in far as evidence both from really tightly controlled feeding studies and from some of the best controlled interventions to date. Bleak midwinter, because this was the period where coronary heart disease mortality rates in the 1950s and 60s and 70s in Western industrialized countries, the United States, the UK, Finland, and some other countries in particular, was almost twice as high as it is now. It was the major leading public health concern of the day. And it was important that interventions and understandings were developed to be able to try and intervene to shift the burden of this disease in the population. So in the background of all of this really high rates of cardiovascular disease, a number of research groups began to look at diet. And we're going right the way back now. This is a study that was published in 1956 by this group, Ahrens and colleagues. And again, these are old graphs that were hand drawn on tech drawing paper, so forgive them for not being nice, fancy, modern graphs. What's really cool, you can see up top here, animal fat, plant fat, animal fat, plant fat. These were tightly controlled feeding studies where individuals were being kept on a ward, fed everything, measured, controlled every aspect of diet, and they were being monitored for changes in their blood cholesterol levels. And all they were doing was they were literally just transitioning them. So total energy held constant, so they maintained their body weight, carbohydrate and protein held constant, and fat kept at the same level of total fat. But all they did was shift the source of that fat, animal, plant. Now, at this point, we're really kind of not making that much of a distinction beyond these broad characteristics, animal and plant. But you can clearly see here, there's total cholesterol, free cholesterol, cholesterol esters. We look at total cholesterol, control animal fat, and then they go to the plant fat, cholesterol levels drop, back onto the animal fat, increases, back onto the plant fat, drops. So this was a study using a mix of a margarine, corn oil, and they had this salad oil, which they didn't actually specify what that was. And what they stated in their conclusions, our data show that free and total cholesterol levels decrease proportionately when plant fat replaces animal fat in the diet. So a picture starting to emerge that plant fats of vegetable origin might be useful in lowering cholesterol levels. This was followed on by another study which did a similar experimental approach, tightly controlled metabolic ward, altering, in this case, the total fat content, but not from the different source. So they were alternating feeding of vegetable fat using corn oil, but with two different levels of total fat, 28% of energy, all coming from corn oil as the primary fat, and then bumping that up to like 42% of dietary total fat intake. And 58. And what they found was that at either level of these levels of total fat intake, when corn oil was the primary fat in the diet, then plasma cholesterol levels decreased. So this is with a specific oil. Again, this is a seed oil that is often vilified. And we're seeing an application here that could be of relevance to cardiovascular disease in the real world. Of course, this is just looking at blood cholesterol levels, not mortality outcomes. Enter Antal Keys himself. This was the biggest synthesis of metabolic ward studies to date that they had conducted, manipulating multiple components of diet. And what they came up with was this thing called the Keys equation. And this is our kind of regression line. All these dots around it are basically changes in cholesterol level that were observed manipulating the fat source in the diet. And it came up using a different array of different sources of polyunsaturated fats, omega-6 rich cottonseed oil, corn oil, sunflower seed oil, safflower oil. Again, these are the oils that are front and center of the anti-seed oil crowd as toxic, apparently. What this came up with was what's known as the Keys equation. This equation translated into English means that saturated fatty acids have twice the impact on raising cholesterol as the cholesterol lowering effect of polyunsaturated fats or omega-6 linoleic acid. This still stands to this day. You can look at the levels of polyunsaturated fat in someone's diet, and you can model to a degree of accuracy the changes in their blood cholesterol levels that we would anticipate from that relationship. And there's inter-individual difference, so there is variation there. But the point is, again, looking at the types of oils that are being used here, we're seeing that this is the most important determinant of blood cholesterol levels in humans. So, okay, we've looked at the intermediate risk factor that we now in 2023 know to be the causal pathway of atherosclerosis and cardiovascular disease. We know that replacing animal fat with vegetable fat, even if it's any of these oils, cottonseed, sunflower, canola, or corn oil, will lower cholesterol levels. What about hard outcomes? This is one of the first trials to do this, the Dayton and colleagues trial. And this was in veterans living in a home. And this is, for its time, a highly impressive intervention. This kept diet going because they were in a facility. They were able to really tightly control the provision of diet to participants. They were able to take tissue samples to verify adherence to the diets using biomarkers of linoleic acid in adipose tissue compared to saturated fatty acids. The trial went on for 8 years in total, and they maintained double blinding. The participants were blinded throughout this entire period of the intervention, and they were able to have a really effective contrast. Linoleic acid and polyunsaturated fats were really high in the intervention group, and the control group was consuming around 15% of energy from saturated fat. So we could see in terms of percentage of total fatty acids, the control only 10% linoleic acid, 38% of total fatty acids coming from omega-6 linoleic acid. And over 8 years, we can see this is the experimental group in the dashed line. This is the control group in the solid black line. And you can see that, I mean, really by year 2, the hazard ratios have started to diverge. And they're not significant over those first few years, although the risk overall is clearly lower in the experimental group, and ultimately culminated over 8 years in a 20% relative risk reduction in the experimental, in the treatment group compared to the controls. And what was the intervention? A mix of corn, soybean oil, safflower oil, cottonseed oil, replacing saturated fat. So again, all of these oils that are supposedly toxic, leading to reductions in blood cholesterol levels that corresponded to a 20% reduction in risk for myocardial infarction or sudden cardiac death over 8 years. Across the pond to Norway, to the Oslo Diet Heart Study, again, a long-term trial that was confirmed in terms of adherence with biomarker analysis. And this aimed for 20% of total energy. So this isn't fat calories, this is total calories, 20% from polyunsaturated fat. That's higher than we'd even recommend now. And remember our evolutionary polyunsaturated to saturated fat ratio of 1.4? Well, they've raised that again, 2.4 in the experimental group. So high polyunsaturated fat, high omega-6 diet, using vegetable oils generally. They didn't actually define it in the Oslo Diet Heart study, but given what was prevalent at the time, we would assume it's possibly a mix of these oils that we've seen before. And over 11 years of follow-up, again, big difference between the controls. It was about a 30% risk reduction in the diet group compared to the controls, which we can see here, the diet group in black. So their risk of a primary endpoint of a myocardial infarction, a heart attack, basically, that's either fatal or non-fatal, was 30% lower in the diet group. Then there was the Finnish mental hospital study. Again, similarly verified dietary intakes, primarily soybean oil in this trial, and also verifying adherence to the diet through biomarkers. And we can see pretty high linoleic acid intake, specifically up here, up to top 34 grams per day. Polyunsaturated fat to saturated ratio that's pretty much bang on what we saw in our ancestors, our good old ancestors. So we're around that same level. But we've got a pretty high omega-6 linoleic acid here. And there was a 41% risk reduction when both primary and secondary prevention was considered. So people who hadn't had a heart attack before or a primary event versus people who had already had an event and were looking to avoid having a second coronary heart disease event. So both combined, 41% lower risk. And when it was just primary prevention, also a 40% lower risk of coronary heart disease death or myocardial infarction. And because they measured biomarkers, we know that linoleic acid levels, omega-6 levels in adipose tissue, and adipose tissue as a biomarker is the best long-term marker that we have in the body. So adipose tissue fatty acids typically represent dietary intake over a period of up to previous 2 years. So linoleic acid in adipose tissue tripled in the intervention group, and we see this reduction. So what happens when we take all of these trials conducted with this level of rigor? They're long-term trials. Adherence is confirmed by biomarkers. We know what the interventions was. Blinding is maintained. The participants have taken very high levels of, in this case, seed oils or vegetable oils. Well, this was a meta-analysis by Frank Sachs and colleagues for the AHA a couple of years ago. And there was all of the trials we've just looked at. So Dayton was the first one. Oslo was the second, Finnish was the third, the MRC was the other trial that they included here, UK Medical Research Council trial. Again, look at these toxic oils. In the Dayton and colleagues trial, like we said, it was corn, soybean, safflower, cottonseed. In the Oslo Diet Heart study, it was vegetable oils, it was undefined. In the MRC trial in Britain, in London, it was soybean oil. And in the Finnish hospital trial, it was vegetable oils generally, with soybean as the predominant source of those oils. And when we synthesize all of this evidence together, what we ended up with was a 29% lower risk of coronary heart disease and a range of 18 as the upper bound, up to about a 38%. They're the confidence intervals. So this is now building on, we have the evidence from metabolic ward studies precisely showing that replacing polyunsaturated fats with saturated fats, or replacing saturated with polyunsaturated fats using these very oils will lead to significant and pronounced reductions in cholesterol levels, blood cholesterol levels. Does that translate to reduced risk of death from heart disease? Yes, it does. The robust body of evidence that we have, particularly from these trials that are the best conducted human interventions, and again, mostly conducted in this period using these very oils, have corroborated the tightly controlled feeding studies by showing us that there's this reduction in actual hard endpoints as well, using these very oils that are supposedly toxic. Okay, any evidence base has its conflicts. And with the seed oil and omega-6 research, that conflict very much brings us to Sydney, or to the Sydney Diet Heart study. And with any evidence base, it's not simply the presence of alternate evidence that exists, it's whether that alternate evidence holds up to scrutiny in its methodology, and then consequently whether that means that we should be either questioning the other evidence, or does it in fact give us an opportunity to reconcile that other evidence against the discrepant research. So let's think about the Sydney Diet Heart Study, because I think it's really important to address head on any research that suggests the opposite to what we've just looked at. This was an updated analysis of the Sydney Diet Heart Study, and then a meta-analysis including the Sydney Diet Heart Study. And they took what they called recovered data. There was some data that they had that the researchers from the Sydney Diet Heart Study had, and they reanalyzed it in this study. And the Sydney Diet Heart Study aimed to give 15% of energy from polyunsaturated fats, replacing 15% of energy from saturated fats. So their aim was to get saturated fats down to about kind of 7 or 8%. And then the control group had 15% saturated fat. And they were provided with a margarine and an oil from safflower and sunflower oil. The margarine we know the brand of, and this is going to be important. But basically, you can see that in this reanalysis, this is green here. This is the intervention group. Okay, so this is the group given the margarine and the oil compared to the control group. And the hazard ratio here was 1.70. So this suggested that those in the intervention group had a 70% higher risk of death from cardiovascular disease over this 5-year period. And then they updated it into a meta-analysis, including the Minnesota coronary experiment, which they stratified by sex. SDHS here is our Sydney Diet Heart Study. And then one more trial, the Rose corn oil trial. Rose was the name of the lead author, corn oil trial. And unlike what we've just seen with those core trials, these are all over here. These are all suggesting an increased risk. And their final conclusion, it was just over, not statistically significant, but we can see the direction of effect for their conclusion was that these linoleic acid intervention groups resulted in a 33% higher risk of cardiovascular disease mortality. Okay, so how do we begin to reconcile this against all of the evidence I've just presented that suggests the opposite? The first thing is just at the level of the meta-analysis in terms of critiquing. Minnesota coronary experiment was a really poorly conducted intervention. It wasn't continuous. It was conducted in an inpatient context where participants were leaving and coming back into the study. There wasn't really good account for when they were in or out of the study, and there's no real ability to understand how background diet may have influenced the findings. But if we just look at the confidence intervals here in numeric form, and then here, we can really see that this is really a very imprecise finding. The confidence intervals, although the point estimate suggests a 16% higher risk, the confidence intervals go from 0.78 to 1.71. These are as wide as barn doors. They're so wide as to be practically meaningless, because the direction of effect could be anywhere in here were we to repeat this study another 20 times, for example. It's even worse for women. It's 1.09 as a point estimate, and the confidence intervals are literally spread-eagled across this. Again, as wide as a barn door, wider than the estimates for male. So this just isn't a particularly precise study or finding to be relying on relative to the methodological quality of the other studies. So I just don't think Minnesota coronary experiment is something that we could really rely on. Sydney Diet Heart, I'm going to come on to specifically, and then Rose corn oil as well, because most of the direction of effect here was driven by the Sydney Diet Heart Study. And we can see that this was the only of these 3 included trials that was statistically significant and this large direction of effect. The thing to note is that the margarine used in the Sydney Diet Heart Study is likely to have contained large amounts of trans fatty acids, and potentially the oil as well, but specifically the margarine. We don't have any data on whether participants consumed more of the margarine or the oil, but we do know that the margarine used at the time was part of a production of margarine that likely had high amounts of trans fatty acids. This was the norm for the time if care wasn't taken in the actual preparation and the specific oil that was used. These margarines also, although they were billed as polyunsaturated spreads, also had quite high levels of saturated fatty acids. So if this is a combination of high trans fat and saturated fatty acids, then it possibly isn't surprising that we end up with this higher risk in the intervention group. But part of the problem is this trial was conducted so long ago that even though this group managed to get some updated data, we don't have answers to these questions. And so I'm even offering a degree of speculation that I'm not comfortable with. So if we are to really reconcile this, then we need to consider, how does this trial bear in with the other evidence that we have? Well, this is actually being done. So here is a wider list of interventions, all defined by their high omega-6 level in the intervention group compared to the controls. Okay, so we've got trials, some of which we've looked at already. We've got the Oslo trial here, LA Veterans, which is the Dayton and colleagues trial, UK Medical Research Council trial, the DART trial we didn't look at specifically. And here's SDHS, here's the Sydney Diet Hearts. You can see the direction of effect in all these trials. This is just kind of sitting in the middle, nothing really happened in that trial. And then we've got Sydney over here. So just visually and looking at the forest plot for this meta-analysis, we know that Sydney Diet Heart is the anomaly. So what this group did was they calculated the overall effect of all of these trials together. And then they calculated the overall effect, excluding the Sydney Diet Heart study, because it's clearly the anomaly. In the overall effect, we've still got a signal in the noise. It looks like a 14% lower risk, but it's not statistically significant. The confidence intervals go over 1 to 1.07. But once you remove the Sydney Diet Heart study, then the finding becomes statistically significant in favor of omega-6 linoleic acid interventions. A 19% relative risk reduction and a range of 32 to 2% lower. So even with the speculation that the margarine used in SDHS was high in saturated, or was high in trans fatty acids, and we know that they have really negative consequences on cardiovascular health, even with the speculation of, did the participants use more of the margarine or the oil, we don't have the ability to reconcile that. So all we can do is think about whether Sydney Diet Heart is robust enough methodologically to turn all of this other evidence on its head. And there isn't any way in scientific evaluation that we would take a study with so many unknowns and compare it to studies, like I said, that we do know that double blinding was maintained, that the intervention verified adherence with biomarkers, that there was a long duration of follow-up, that a high level of omega-6 linoleic acid and specific vegetable oils were used, that we know that the participants achieved specific intakes of those specific foods. There's no way we take that evidence and say, yes, Sydney Diet Heart overrules that. There's no epistemic construct that exists that we would make that decision. And we can clearly see the effect that that one trial has on the overall evidence base, swaying it away, but not entirely, because the direction of effect here is still clear. So even with Sydney Diet Heart included in the overall evidence base, there's still a trend towards a reduction in risk from omega-6. And then once you leave Sydney Diet Heart out, that trend is no longer a trend, and it's a statistically significant reduction in risk. What about the Rose corn oil trial? This was an analysis of trans fats in oils, and it looked at all of these different oils: corn oil, rapeseed oil, soybean oil. And what it found was that in response to heating, what you get was about 25.25 grams per 100 grams of trans fatty acids in the corn oil. Now, the corn oil trial itself was a really, really small study, and there was a very small amount of deaths. So it's highly prone to the bias that a small trial has. There was 12 deaths over a 24-month period in the corn oil group. There was 9 deaths in the olive oil group. Most of those deaths in the corn oil and olive oil group were equal until about 18 months into the trial. And based on this, it's possible that, again, this trial is confounded by trans fats. We know that for rapeseed oil, soybean oil, olive oil, sesame oil, trans fat's non-detectable in this analysis, but something about corn oil in terms of its composition or reactivity might mean that in terms of cooking with it produces trans fatty acids. So overall, to come back to this meta-analysis, this is cited over and over. I don't think we can rely on it. There's nothing that we can glean from Minnesota coronary experiment overall. It's such an imprecise study that it really just isn't a reliable piece of data. The Sydney Diet Heart study, again, we've got these red flags over it for potential confounding by trans fats, as we do for the Rose corn oil trial. When we actually synthesize the totality of evidence, these stats don't hold up. And ultimately, omega-6, we can explain the findings of the trials that purport to contradict the overall evidence base of a benefit to omega-6, linoleic acid, and some of these oils for cardiovascular risk. Okay, so we have two questions to ask then at the end of this, because like I said, evidence base has evidence to the contrary or seemingly to the contrary. So if some trials show adverse effects, what characteristics of those trials differ from the trials that show a benefit? Well, in this case, it's the trials that show a benefit that are of far more methodological robustness. So we obviously lean towards them. And if some trials show an adverse effect, how do they reconcile against the totality of evidence? Well, sure, if we take really crappy small trials, poorly executed, and compile them together in a meta-analysis, then we get an output that looks potentially like it contradicts the overall evidence. But garbage in, garbage out with a meta-analysis. When we confine our analysis to methodologically robust trials, we see the exact opposite. So again, that's what we lean into. Okay, what about linoleic acid in the body? So do we see increases in arachidonic acid? So this is one of the most common proposals for an effect of linoleic acid or omega-6 is that it will increase inflammation. But it's not linoleic acid that's directly used to synthesize inflammatory markers in the body, it's arachidonic acid. So this was an analysis that looked at increases in linoleic acid intake of up to and over 500% in this data point, and looking at the change in serum or plasma levels of arachidonic acid. And we basically see no change. These data points are all clustered around basically zero. So even if you're massively increasing the level of linoleic acid as a percentage of energy in the diet, you're not changing the circulating levels of arachidonic acid as the inflammatory mediator. And this is because arachidonic acid levels are just maintained within quite tight ranges in the body, and those levels aren't easily disrupted. We could see the same outcome for this analysis when linoleic acid was represented in grams per day, and this is change in arachidonic acid levels in plasma. And again, we just really don't see any responsive arachidonic acid. You can see transient responses that might be within a range of plus or minus 10%, but there's no relationship between those changes and dose. So ultimately, we're not really able to bump up levels of inflammatory mediators in the body just by consuming more linoleic acid in the diet. This was an updated meta-analysis of multiple inflammatory markers. C-reactive protein is probably the most important from a cardiovascular health perspective. It's an independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease. In observational research, we can see strengths of association between CRP and cardiovascular disease that are sometimes on a par with what we would see for LDL cholesterol. And it's a systemic marker of inflammation, whereas LDL is obviously quite a specific biomarker. C-reactive protein is a marker of just general systemic inflammation. So this analysis came along. You can see a huge number of trials. One of the important things to note here is that the effect size is standardized mean difference. So that's not mean difference in represented as C-reactive protein. A standardized mean difference is an effect size. So that's how we interpret it. And overall, all of these trials, you can see here, again, really wide, imprecise estimates spread across wide confidence intervals. The overall effect, 0.09. Now, effect size is typically 0.2 would be considered a small effect size. 0.5 would be considered moderate, and 0.8 or over would be considered large effect size. That's 0.2, 4, and 5, not 0.09. This is a negligible effect size to the point of non-existent. But the one trial that does, and all of these trials, every single included trial is spread across this 0, no real effect, or if there is an effect, it's imprecise and not significant, except for this trial, this Juncker and colleagues trial, which seemingly was adding a lot to the direction of effect. So let's go and look at kind of each of these oils in this, and then let's go and look at the specific trial. So this is soybean, sunflower, sesame, corn oil. Again, standardized mean difference for all of these going from minus to above. So there's no real signal in the noise here at all for C-reactive protein as a marker for inflammation, really, from any of these from any of these oils. With soybean oil in particular, there is an effect size that we would consider small, but it's an imprecise effect size. And again, it's not significant. It's really just broad and across the null. So what about this trial that seemingly looked like there was an increase in C-reactive protein from vegetable oils or omega-6 linoleic acid? So this is the trial itself. What's misleading about the standardized mean difference in the previous study that we're looking at is that SMD will calculate the difference between your treatment groups. What happened in this trial was we had olive oil here, sunflower oil, and rapeseed oil. We can see C-reactive protein. This is the before the wash-in period. This is the start of the intervention, and then after 4 weeks. So it's 0.71 in the olive oil trial at the start, and then it's 0.52 at the end. And then in the sunflower oil, it's 0.90, then it's 0.75 at the end. And the rapeseed oil, it's 0.50 and 0.44. So C-reactive protein decreased in both the sunflower and rapeseed oil, both of these seed oils groups, C-reactive protein decreased. So why did it look in this meta-analysis like this is to the right of the line, giving you an impression that it increased? Well, it's because it didn't decrease as much as olive oil. So comparing olive oil to sunflower oil, there's actually quite a big difference. 0.75 milligrams per deciliter is where or milligrams per liter is where CRP ended up, and 0.52. So you can see the difference here is, nearly like 0.23. So it's an artifact of the fact that the greater magnitude of decrease occurred in the olive oil group. It's not saying that C-reactive protein increased, because clearly it didn't in either of the seed oil groups in this study. So this isn't looking good for inflammation, either in terms of arachidonic acid changes in the body or actual inflammatory markers itself. What about lipid peroxidation? So this is possibly one of the most common and consistent claims. People will say, well, you have these oils, they're prone to oxidize so that the fatty acids go rancid, essentially. That will cause oxidative stress in the body, and that's why you get these negative health outcomes. Well, it turns out we can actually measure oxidative stress. So here was a study that looked at sunflower and rapeseed oil, and this is MDA, it's malondialdehyde. So MDA, I'm just going to call it MDA, is a end product of lipid peroxidation in the body. So if we've got high levels of lipid peroxidation, MDA is its end product, and we would expect that to increase. And what we have here is this milk fat diet at baseline, sunflower and rapeseed oil. And you can see 1.13 at baseline, 1.11, 1.11, so no change. And again, they used two different methods of quantifying it. Didn't matter. Whatever method they used to measure MDA didn't change in either sunflower or rapeseed oil. Glutathione, which is an antioxidant, again, didn't change. So our oxidative stress levels are not going up. But what they did do with this study was an in vitro study. So this was in humans. Then they did an in vitro study, a cell culture study. And what they looked at was oxidation of VLDL and LDL. And they did find that there was faster oxidation of LDL and VLDL with the sunflower and rapeseed oil diets. And you would go, aha. Well, no, this is a really good point of the difference between in vitro cell cultures when you isolate a compound versus in vivo human physiology, where these oils don't just have fats as part of their nutritional characteristics. They come with high levels of vitamin E, the tocopherols, which are themselves the primary fat-soluble antioxidant. They come with other compounds or polyphenols and otherwise. So you isolate something in a Petri dish and you see some effects and you think, aha, this is what we see in real life. And this is what people do with the seed oil debate, right? They focus on experimental models. And this study is a great example of the difference between and why we don't rely on in vitro studies to make informed decisions about human health outcomes. Because in vitro, you could see this effect where there seemingly was greater oxidation with sunflower and rapeseed oil. And in vivo, in real life humans, there was no change in any of their measured markers of lipid peroxidation or of oxidative stress. Another example of a trial, the same lipid peroxidation here. This was using isoprostanes. So isoprostanes are even a better marker again than MDA itself. And baseline rapeseed oil or saturated fat diet, this slightly increased from baseline in terms of free isoprostane prostaglandins, but total prostaglandins actually decreased in both groups. And again, MDA here and hydroxyperoxides, like just no change overall. But what could explain that? Again, the importance of the difference between in vitro and in vivo. Antioxidant levels in rapeseed oil is quite high in the tocopherols. This is vitamin E, and we could see quite a significant increase in tocopherol levels in serum and plasma. So again, that's why we rely on how do these oils behave in humans rather than just looking at animal models or a Petri dish. This is, again, another study, oxidative stress, looking at this polyunsaturated comparison between high levels, 11% in the intervention group and 3% in the control group. Again, no change in these markers of oxidative stress. So overall, there's really, unless you're finding a rodent or a cell culture study, which people do, there is no human outcome evidence really of any sort of quality to suggest that these oils increase oxidative stress or inflammation in the body. And just to hammer this home, that the early interventions that we looked at, the metabolic ward studies, weren't just dated research that's since been shown. This is a much more recent updated meta-analysis focusing specifically on canola oil, or we would call it rapeseed oil in Europe, and looking at blood cholesterol levels. And this is comparing it to sunflower oil, so another omega-6 rich polyunsaturated fat. And we actually see a benefit to rapeseed oil compared to sunflower oil in terms of lowering LDL cholesterol, but it's modest. And this is weighted mean difference. So this is represented as cholesterol. So this is 5.83 milligrams per deciliter lower LDL cholesterol from rapeseed oil compared to sunflower, and then compared to olive oil, pretty similar magnitude of effect. But let's compare it to saturated fat, which again, remember, we replace saturated with polyunsaturated fats. We get this pronounced cholesterol reduction, nearly 25 milligram per deciliter reduction when canola oil replaces saturated fat in randomized control trials. So this is an updated, just to confirm that the Ansel Keys and colleagues' research in the 50s hasn't ever been refuted by experimental evidence on the effects of dietary fat and blood cholesterol. Okay, so running into the home straight on this. So what happens when we measure linoleic acid and omega-6 in populations? So we've seen intervention trials, we've seen metabolic ward studies, and we've seen experimental research on inflammation and lipid peroxidation. But again, these are small trials, often, some of them are bigger, but we're taking a subset of the population. What happens when we go large on a population scale? Maybe we might see something different. Well, to grasp the veracity of this evidence, I want to introduce the concept of biomarkers. So a biomarker, and I've mentioned it a few times already, it's a specific measure that provides an indication of nutrient intake in the body. So we can have concentration biomarkers, either in serum here or plasma. We can have concentrations in adipose tissue. So typically, if we're measuring the levels of something in a tissue, it's known as a concentration biomarker. Or we can take urinary samples if we wanted to look at sodium, and that's known as a recovery biomarker, because you've got to recover all of the, in this case, urine, for example, or saliva. If you wanted to use that, you've got to recover all of that sample in order to analyze. So for linoleic acid, we're concentrating on concentration biomarkers. These are our main focus because we can measure the levels of omega-6 linoleic acid in different tissue compartments. And the crucial thing that makes omega-6 important and really objective as a biomarker, even though we're looking at epidemiology, is that because it's an essential fatty acid, we cannot synthesize linoleic acid in the body. That means any linoleic acid that's in your adipose tissue, that's in your cholesterol esters, that's in your plasma, is there because you consumed it in the diet. This makes linoleic acid a really robust biomarker that we can measure in different tissues. Another important characteristic of biomarkers from a dietary perspective is that different biomarkers represent different time courses related to dietary intake. So for red blood cells, because our red blood cells turn over on average every 128 days, red blood cell measures of a nutrient or a fatty acid, for example, reflect about 3 months of previous dietary intake. Serum is way more short-term, about 3 to 4 days. And then cholesterol esters, which, part of like lipoproteins and cholesterols in the body and the plasma, around 2 to 3 weeks. And then adipose tissue up to 2 years. So this is really important because it means that we're kind of piecing together different pictures of relationships with dietary intake. Okay, so let's go to a study, the Kuopio ischemic heart disease risk factor study, which is a long ongoing study in Finland. It's been up and running for 30, maybe 40 years now. And they looked at serum levels of linoleic acid as a percentage of all fatty acids in the circulation. And this was cardiovascular disease death over here. And we can see that this is a linear reduction in risk as the actual percentage of fatty acids from linoleic acid in your plasma increase. And we can see this over about 20%. So when 20% of all fatty acids in your serum are linoleic acid, from there onwards, there's lower risk of cardiovascular death. Okay, so this was quite significant, 46% lower risk of cardiovascular disease mortality. And what was interesting about this is this study was in the context of a large public health intervention in Finland that began in the 1970s, attempting to lower the burden of cardiovascular disease. And it was a big public health education campaign to get people to replace butter with soft margarines, to use more vegetable oils. And what was interesting was the highest intake of linoleic acid in the study came from margarines. So not all margarines were necessarily confounded with trans fats. It depended on how and what they were made with. But again, indicative of the fact that with increasing objective measured linoleic acid in the body, there's a reduction in cardiovascular disease event risk. So importantly, this is serum. So if we are relating this to diet, this is very much something that we would relate to only very immediate short-term intake. And that could be a caveat that we would hold as a potential limitation of the study. But we can look at other markers. We can look at this meta-analysis. This comes from an overall meta-analysis of cohort studies, prospective cohort studies that measured different tissue biomarkers of linoleic acid. We've got these different outcomes here. So you can see phospholipid levels, total plasma levels of omega-6, cholesterol esters, adipose tissue. And this is total cardiovascular disease. We can see the overall in bold, cardiovascular disease mortality, total coronary heart disease, and then stroke. The reason I have cholesterol esters circled in green is because this is the tissue compartment in the human body with the highest concentrations of linoleic acid. Like if we're saying that this is toxic, if we're saying that the food sources that provide omega-6 linoleic acid are toxic, then we should be able to see that when we measure it in different compartments, but particularly in the compartment in which the concentrations of this supposedly toxic fatty acid or inflammatory fatty acid are found. And actually what we see here is really instructive. So let's take total cardiovascular disease up top. The overall risk reduction here is statistically significant, but it's a modest 7%. But let's look at cholesterol esters. It's a 26% lower risk. when we focus on the compartment with the highest concentration of linoleic acid in the body. Let's look at cardiovascular disease mortality, not just total cardiovascular disease. This is actually a stronger summary. So every single one of these compartments adds up to a 22% significant lower risk of mortality. But then we look at cholesterol esters, it's 44% lower risk. Same, total coronary heart disease, the total effect overall is 6% lower. Cholesterol esters, 22% lower. This is really powerful evidence that not only is every tissue compartment here individually associated with lower risk, the compartment that we find the highest concentrations of linoleic acid in the body is associated with a degree of lower risk that is by orders of magnitude greater than the summary for that particular outcome. We can follow this on again. This was a meta-analysis that, again, just combined all of these different tissue compartments into an overall summary estimate of effect, 11% lower. So it doesn't matter whether we're looking at adipose tissue, which is linoleic acid over 1 to 2 years, phospholipids, shorter term, cholesterol esters, 2 to 3 weeks of dietary intake and the highest concentrations in the body, red blood cells, erythrocytes, about 3 months of previous dietary intake, serum or plasma, 2 to 3 days. All of these, the direction of effect, lower risk, and the combined effect, lower risk. So this is biomarkers, but I wanted to start to stack this against dietary estimates, dietary assessment of linoleic acid. So this is the same. So this is percentage of linoleic acid in the diet going from 1 up to 12. And this is cardiovascular disease mortality. And here we've got this linear risk reduction. And this is a huge sample size, nearly 800,000 participants, different populations. Linoleic acid is a percentage of energy linearly associated as we get up to this level of 11-12%, which was the maximum threshold in these cohorts, we've got linear reduction in cardiovascular disease risk. So it's corresponding to what we see when we measure levels in the body. Okay, let's actually think about this in relation to our ancestors, or that absurd claim about our ancestral kind of diet. So I basically added these red dashed lines. This is roughly the upper threshold. Remember that those ancestral diets seem to have, or the estimates modeled a range of 1 to 1.7 to 6.2%. So I chose 6% as this cutoff point here. And this corresponds, so this is percentage of linoleic acid in the diet. And over here is how much your plasma phospholipid levels of linoleic acid increase in response to diet. And what we can see is right the way up to that upper ancestral estimate, we get a linear increase in plasma phospholipid levels. And this also corresponds then. So if we look at, okay, well, where is this threshold here? It's roughly around 20%. When we get up to around 6% of linoleic acid intake, or nearly really 8% at peaks. And when you've got 8% of your diet from linoleic acid, you've really got maximal, near maximal phospholipid levels, plasma levels of linoleic acid. And then that's also then see over 18% was the bottom here where it starts to rise. And 18%, this is now all-cause mortality, is where we see this drop-off. So even if we were to assume, if someone was to argue based on the ancestral research that you would actually want it to be lower, well, yeah, sure, the upper bound was 6%, but actually the average was, say, 3, and you want it to be closer to 3. This just refutes that. You'd want it to be higher because you'd want to increase the proportion of plasma fatty acids from linoleic acid based on this related to the lower risk of mortality. So there's just benefit here in terms of these ancestral ranges. So up to and beyond that, increasing your plasma levels corresponds to decreasing mortality risk. What about diet? Let's come back to this graph we just looked at. Bang on 6%. This is that upper limit of the ancestral threshold. Well, look to the right of this. So if we go over that threshold, it's still just declining. It's not like there's a ceiling based on our ancestors that said, this is how much linoleic acid you should have and no more. So up to and beyond ancestral range estimates, increasing linoleic acid corresponds to decreased cardiovascular death risk. In this study, each 5% increase in energy from linoleic acid associated with a 7% lower cardiovascular risk. So even if we assume that that upper range of those model estimates from our ancestral diet is something that we could be legitimate, modern evidence shows us there's still a benefit in going even higher than that. So to wrap it all out, just a reminder, this is not a one-off finding. This is another meta-analysis that showed exactly the same thing. So here's our 6% threshold. To the right of this line, following the red pointer, keeps just going down. So there isn't a hard cutoff based on any sort of ancestral estimates. Across a range of linoleic acid as a percentage of energy from 1 to 9 to 10 to 11%, we see a benefit across the board, across that range, such that there's greater level of risk reduction with a greater proportion of energy from linoleic acid omega-6. So, summary. What about our ancestors? Well, this is my response now. Who cares? Okay. We have speculative evidence that is based on, very, very difficult to do research. But we've got modern evidence to tell us all that we need to know. There's no reason that we necessarily need to rely on whatever our ancestors ate. We've got an evidence base now. Our ancestors' case steps right into its own fallacy as well, right? Because the higher end of the estimated range, based on everything we know now, is preferable to the lower end of that range. So even if there's an argument that lies within, well, you want it to be within those ancestral ranges, you'd still want higher compared to lower. The production process is obviously filled with lots of big, scary sounding, chemically sounding technical words that are easy prey for quacks to play on naturalistic fallacies and government wants to kill you conspiratorial narratives. There's no detectable hexane left over in the final product that's of any concern to human health. A robust body of 70 years of evidence shows that the replacement of saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat, including oils rich in omega-6, lowers blood cholesterol levels and cardiovascular disease and coronary heart disease events and mortality. And if linoleic acid omega-6 was toxic, this should readily be apparent when we actually measure levels of it in the body, because we can't get it unless we have an exogenous source. Except the literature on biomarkers of omega-6 linoleic acid is defined by the complete absence of evidence of risk associated with concentrations of linoleic acid in the body. So unlike some of the food-based research like Sydney Diet Heart, where you can find some discrepant studies and people can say, aha, this is actually the one that shows these are problematic, there's nothing in the biomarker research anyone can point to actually corroborate that kind of finding. These associations are independent of the compartment measured. So adipose tissue, phospholipids, plasma phospholipids, serum cholesterol esters. Biomarker associations corroborate dietary assessment analyses, and linoleic acid biomarkers do correlate well with dietary intake of linoleic acid. So there's no legitimate science-based reason to avoid certain oils, nuts, or seeds due to concern about omega-6 fats. And for people that consume very little, modest increases in daily energy intake derived from omega-6 would appear to be preferable to just having a very, very base low, just above basic requirement levels. In order to sustain the case that omega-6 linoleic acid intake is deleterious to human health, someone must provide a rebuttal to multiple lines of evidence from randomized control trials, prospective cohort studies, biomarker studies, metabolic ward studies, which all converge to the same conclusion that at the very least, omega-6 seed oils, linoleic acid in seed oils, and these foods and products are at least not harmful, but actually, when we really dig into the evidence, they're likely to be beneficial. So, as always, I will leave you with nihilistic penguin, my spirit animal, and I hope that was helpful.